Well, today we're in Ezekiel chapter 46, and I've titled this Offerings and Feasts. That's what this chapter is about. Kind of continues and concludes the discussion of the previous chapter about the temple ministry. And it contains a rather extensive list of regulations that are governing offerings and feasts, and continues the level of both bewildering and comforting detail that we see in Ezekiel chapter 44. Take a drink here. It's got kind of a detailed outline here. I'm somewhat tempted to just give you the outline and finish the video, but I will make comments on each section. But again, this is a great opportunity for you to try to just get the big picture, focus on skimming through this chapter as it goes through the various offerings and feasts that will be existent during the time of the kingdom. So, in terms of outline, and again, what I do, let me turn the page in my own Bible here. Oh, here it is. What I do in my Bible is I simply take a pencil, and in the margin next to the section, I'll make a little tick mark at the end of verse 5. And in the right, I'll put a label there, Sabbath offerings. That's the first heading of the outline of this chapter. Verses 1 through 5 are about Sabbath offerings. 6 and 7 are about new moon offerings, and we'll talk about why do they have these in a minute. Verses 8 through 10 are regulations about the entry and exit of the temple. Verses 11 through 12, we see the prince's offerings. 13 through 15 is about burnt offerings. 16 through 18 about laws of inheritance. And finally, 19 through 24 is all about, of all things, kitchens. Yes, you heard me right. It's about kitchens. So we'll come there and we'll see why the Lord cares about kitchens. So, in verses 1 through 5, the gate of the inner court facing east, so this is the gate entering into that courtyard, is only opened on Sabbath and new moon observances. That's the only time this is open. There is an exception later when we talk about the prince's offerings, but for regular service, it's only the Sabbath and the new moon offerings. In verse 3, the people are told on how they are to gather. So God wants kind of orderly worship here. We see that throughout the Bible, and he has specific instruction on orderly worship. Verses 6 to 7, it begins in verse 6, on the day of the new moon. It sounds kind of new agey, doesn't it? We're going to have new moon festivals. Well, it's important to remember that Israel operated on the basis of a lunar calendar, not a solar calendar that we do. So their feasts are determined according to the phases of the moon. And the new moon signifies or introduces, maybe a better word, a new round of regular offerings. So they celebrate that new moon festival, and verses 6 to 7 give them instruction on how that is to be observed. Verses 8 and through 10, again we see the orderliness that God wants to see among his worshipers. You know, I've been to worship services where people are jumping up, sharing a word, a so-called word from the Lord. They dance around the sanctuary. They are all what they believe to be prophesying at the same time, very chaotic. And this is not the way God wants worship to be conducted. It's clear throughout the Bible that he wants orderly, respectful worship. We see that in verses 8 through 10. The problem here, the issue that's being addressed is that without a western entrance, and since the east entrance is closed, worshipers are going to need to enter and exit through the north and south gates. So you can imagine lines of worshipers coming into the sanctuary, those coming in through the north gate, exiting through the south, and those entering through the south gate will be exiting through the north. So they're passing by each other as they worship the Lord during his millennial reign here. So that's what verses 8 and 10 are talking about. Verses 11 and 12, we see the prince's offerings himself. He will come through that east gate. Remember, said earlier in the chapter, it's normally closed, only opened for the Sabbath and the new moon. But when the prince has free will offerings, they're going to be received through the east gate. So that gate will be open temporarily to receive his particular free will offerings. Now, free will offerings would be happening when they're not required, when they are not called for. So they would be, I'll call it, it's probably not the best term. Don't write me if it offends you, but what I'd call irregular sort of offerings. They're offerings that the prince feels compelled internally and personally to offer. Verses 13 through 16 talk about the morning burnt offering. Some commentators notice that the evening burnt offering is not mentioned here and think that it's just understood that this would be also repeated in the evening. I'm not so sure. My tendency is to stick with what's written, and the worship during the millennial kingdom is not exactly the same as the Mosaic worship. There are differences, so we just have verse 13 talking about the burnt offering in the morning. That's accompanied, according to verse 14, by a grain offering as well. You see inheritance laws down in verse 16. So interesting concern here about the allocation and the maintenance of the land. So the sons of the prince, remember the prince had land himself on either side of the temple compound. The sons of the prince will receive gifts from the prince's inheritance. So he'll pass his legacy down, implying, of course, that there's going to be death during this 1,000-year period, to his sons. When he gives them gifts, it's permanently theirs, right? Now, if the prince gives gifts to his servants, which he can certainly do, he can allocate land from his own estate that the Lord has given him to servants. It's not theirs permanently. It's only there to the year of Jubilee, which occurred every 50th year. So if you were fortunate enough to be serving the prince, and at the right after a year of Jubilee, he gave you an allocation of land, then you have that land in your name for 50 years. If he gives it to you at the end of the 49th year, you may only have a year on that gifted land. So every 50 years or every Jubilee year, that land reverts to the family. Verse 18 is a restriction on the prince. So the prince can't take the inheritance of any other people, of any of the people of Israel. So he's limited in what he can do. And this is consistent with the warnings that were in the previous chapter about not using his position to steal from the people. Come to verses 19 through 24, and this allocates areas at each corner of the temple compound, and they are basically kitchens. They're barbecue pits, if you can imagine, where the preparation of the offerings take place. verse 20, real interesting. He said to me, let me read that for you. This is the place where the priest shall boil the guilt offering and the sin offering, and where they shall bake the grain offering, in order that they might not bring them out into the outer court to transmit holiness to the people. So, interestingly enough, there's a caution here about transferring holiness. What is that about? Well, my thinking is that the holiness of God would be so overwhelming as to be maybe lethal to God, to those who God has not specifically equipped and allowed to approach him. Think of the incident where the Ark of the Covenant was being transported, not by the Levites, as was supposed to happen, but on the back of a cart. And that cart was about, the Ark of the Covenant was about to topple out of the cart, and the man put his hand forward to stabilize it, and he died on the spot. That's the holiness of God, overwhelming and proving lethal. And I think maybe that's the situation here. It's a protection for the people. It's a caution for them. Now, in terms of application, again, a reminder that the details of this chapter, they really don't apply to the church today. They're never going to apply to the church. They apply to Jesus' kingdom and the millennial temple in it. But it does provide us, again, as I mentioned before, with some insight into the character of God. I think we see in these verses that he is detailed, he is orderly, he's precise and exact. Matthew 10:30 says that he knows when a sparrow drops out of the sky. He knows how many hairs I have on my head. Let me ask you, as I ask myself, as I carry out the ministry of Theofaith, as I preach and teach in various venues, I challenge myself, am I giving this kind of attention to detail when I serve the Lord? Are you? Are you giving this kind of attention to detail when you are in a so-called secular job? When you show up for work in the morning, when you are laboring according to God's will for your life, are you being detailed, orderly, precise, and exact in the work that you're doing? Are you being that way in the exercise of the gifts that God has given you? Brothers and sisters, let's learn our lesson from the character of God that we see reflected in Ezekiel chapter 46 and rededicate ourselves today to serving the Lord exactly, precisely, in an orderly way, being scrupulous to obey his word and to do his ministry and to do our work in the way that he wants it done. God bless you, brothers and sisters, and may the Lord bless you as you seek to emulate him at home and at work and in your ministries. God bless you.